Welcome to the AI for Social Good Summit, which has been a month-long regional gathering of experts and practitioners in artificial intelligence and governance, covering topics on skills and capabilities, governance and multi-stakeholder collaborations in the AI field in Asia. As part of this month, we've had a whole series of discussion sessions where we have been looking not only at what it takes to create policies that avoid some of the big risks around the very fast and vast adoption of artificial intelligence in our countries and economies in this region that we're seeing happening, but at the same time also help us leverage the power of artificial intelligence to contribute to the social good of society. Many of you here today will have participated in multiple summit sessions already, and this shows how important these discussions are. So this summit is jointly developed by Google, UN ASCAP and APAU in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. The summit is also the culmination of a 2-year multi-stakeholder project exploring key challenges and opportunities in relation to governance and supporting the application of AI for social good. So if you would like to go deeper into these topics, then you should also look at the AI for Social Good report, which you can download from the summit website. The report features a series of papers developed by experts in AI from this region. And it takes an in-depth look at challenges like incorporating ethics into AI and different kinds of regulatory interventions to leverage AI in contribution to society. Now, today's session is the second policy insight briefing of the summit, and also our last one. Again, we have a fantastic set of AI practitioners and experts involved in policymaking who will be bringing together key takeaways from our previous 2 summit sessions on accountability and regulation and multi-stakeholder governance. Today, we consider the question of what are the most important means of creating institutions and processes that include all stakeholders in AI governance. And as part of this, I would also like to acknowledge the participation at this session of colleagues from the National Innovation Agency in Thailand, the Personal Data Protection Commission PDPC in Singapore, the Union Bank Philippines in the Philippines, the Japan Science and Technology Agency JST from the colleagues based in Singapore, Google, and the Academy of Sciences in Malaysia. And also, I'd like to acknowledge the contributing partners that have joined today from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the University of Hong Kong Science and Technology, and Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. Now today, moderating our discussion will be Carl Troffres. Carl is the co-founder and CEO of Tandemic, an innovation firm based in Southeast Asia. And Carl has helped clients ranging from ADB and UNICEF and UNDP and a number of private sector organizations in setting up innovation teams and innovation labs. And our distinguished panelists today are Dr. P. Anandan, CEO of Wadhwani Institute for AI in India, Professor Tony Askin, Director of Cole Bell School at Australian National University, Professor Jaymund, Director of Institute for Future Government at Yonsei University in South Korea. And I'm very pleased to introduce our government expert, Ania Chaudhry, Policy Advisor with the Government of Bangladesh and UNDP in Bangladesh. I just want to mention that both Anandan and Tony have been advisors for the overall AI for Social Good project, and Jaymund is also one of the contributing academics to the AI for Social Good report. And now I am very pleased to hand over to you, Carl. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christina. And I'm really excited for this panel, this final panel that we're going to be doing on governance and the challenges of governance in the AI for social good space. And so what we're going to be doing today is bringing together some of the key threads that have come up in our last sessions on governance, accountability and regulation, multi-stakeholder governance, and bringing them to the table and hearing about, what are some of the different strategies that we might be applying or thinking about as if we're sitting on the policymaker side to help address these challenges. And so as part of the session, I'm going to kick off I'm going to ask our different panelists to briefly introduce a little bit of the work that they do. Firstly. Secondly, what we'll do is we'll get one of the panelists, Jaymund, to talk a little bit about, what's different when it comes to governance in the AI space, or AI for social good space. Third, we'll have a policymaker, which is Anir, kind of pose some policy challenges that he is wrangling with in his work. And then we'll have the panel respond to some of those policy challenges with some of the strategies that they have seen applied or worthy of exploring in addressing these policy challenges. So maybe let's do a brief sort of self-introductions for our panel. So first, if I could get Anandan, if you could briefly introduce yourself.
I just realized I was on mute. Yeah, thanks, Carl, and thanks, Christina and Vivian and others. Yeah, my name is P. Anandan. I'm the CEO of Vadvani Institute for Artificial Intelligence. We are an independent, not-for-profit organization based in India, working on developing AI innovations and AI-based solutions to a broad variety of social domain problems. Our mission is to see how AI can help address societal challenges, especially for poor and underserved communities throughout the world. India, of course, is the starting point. And we do an end-to-end work. We develop, identify problems in society, work on them, and then try to field test and deploy our solutions. And naturally, in social sector, you have to do this inherently through partnerships with other stakeholders and agencies, government, NGOs, and also tech companies for partnership on the technology side. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Anir, could you tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Thank you, Cal. Can you hear me? I was having some internet problems earlier.
Yes.
Hopefully it's better now. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Anir Chaudhary. I run a program called Aspire to Innovate. It's the government's digital transformation flagship program that's been running for the last 13 years. The Prime Minister's Office, Cabinet Office, and the ICT Ministry. So it actually pans across the entire government, the political nerve center, the bureaucratic nerve center, the ICT nerve center of the government. Work on healthcare, education, agriculture, disaster management. And recently we've been looking at AI as a way to improve our technology systems and as a way to improve service delivery to citizens as well. And grappling with a number of challenges that we'll be discussing today. And we've just developed our first national AI strategy in 7 different sectors. And I'll be talking about maybe a couple of sectors today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Looking forward to hearing your experiences from Bangladesh. Next, we have Tony. Tony, tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me here today. So my name is Tony Erskine. I'm a professor of international politics, and I really look at questions of ethics and norms in international politics. I'm also director of the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University, where I'm chief investigator on a big research project called Humanizing Machine Intelligence. My own recent research really aims to anticipate the risks of using artificial intelligence and automated decision-making in a number of different contexts, but including in a military context.
Thanks so much, Tony. And then we have, as our final panelist, Jaymund. Jaymund, tell us a little bit about your work.
Well, I'm Jaymund. I'm Dean of College of Social Sciences, Yonsei University, and director of the Institute for Future Government. And in fact, my research institute and all the team members have been working on the impact of disruptive technologies, of course, including AI in the public sector. And recently, I have been working on ethical guidelines for AI with some of the government-sponsored research institute in Korea and Korean agencies, so that the AI principles and future application in the public sector and producing public services. Those are some of the things that we have been doing here.
Thanks so much, Jaymund. And I'd like to just stay with you for a moment. If you could tell us a little bit about what you see as the distinctiveness of governing artificial intelligence. Is artificial intelligence just another technology that is disruptive, that is new, that policymakers might regulate or govern in some of the same ways as other technologies, new technologies that we've run into? Or do you see it as fundamentally different in some ways?
Well, probably we should note that there are several distinctive characteristics of AI comparing with the traditional technologies, though there might be also wide variation among different traditional technologies. First of all, AI is basically a general purpose technology rather than very specific purpose technology, which means that the scope of AI application is very broad and will become even broader in future. Secondly, many traditional technologies often replace human physical labors, but AI has been replacing human cognitive and judgmental capacities. This often blur the boundary of humans and machines, of course, which challenges regulatory governance. Thirdly, AI continues to evolve, and by nature, it's very adaptive, which makes human control more challenging. Lastly, I would say the issue of accountability is also very fluid because it is very difficult to locate the point of accountability. When we have a problem with autonomous vehicles, for example, it is not necessarily easy whether the accountability should go to AI developer or deployer, producers, or users, which really makes the AI governance more complicated, complex, and of course, very fluid. So those are some of the main distinctive nature, and probably we should have more.
Thanks for laying that out. And so clearly, we may need a different set of strategies when it comes to governance for artificial intelligence versus other technologies. Now, Anir, in the Bangladesh government, you have been wrangling with some of the different policy challenges that relate to AI. Could you tell us a little bit about, what are some of those policy challenges that you're actively kind of thinking through or working on in Bangladesh?
Thank you, Cal. Let me talk about a couple of challenges that we're dealing with. One that deals with bias. AI is all about data. So as Jaymund just talked about, it actually replaces some of the cognitive decision-making judgments that human beings actually apply. And all of that is based on the training that we provide to the AI system. So we use a lot of data to train AI systems, and that data is used to make judgments in the AI systems. So I'll talk about two different systems that we've been grappling with in the recent times. One is a health system that we developed during the COVID timeframe. We have a national helpline, 333, where people can call in to get information about government services. How do I get a passport? How do I get my national ID? There is some error there, land records, so on and so forth. So information services, people can call in and get that. They also call to get grievance redressal for, let's say, child marriage and all that. We've stopped about 5,500 child marriages in the last 1 year before COVID. So we use that very popular number to create a helpline for health. In the first couple of months of the pandemic, in the March and April timeframe, we had only one a test center in the entire country, 165 million people. So what we had to do was to create a system where people would call in to report symptoms so that we would understand the disease was progressing the fastest. And we have had about 20 million people call in since March when we introduced this system. And there is huge volume of data that we mine every day to understand whether disease is progressing. Now we're in the middle of the second wave almost. This is very, very critical for us. So we combine the lab data now with that syndromic data that's coming in from the phone system, large volumes of data. And what we realize is that many people don't have access to phones, obviously, or they don't have the skills to navigate the fairly complex IVR system where you have to press 1 or 2 or 3 depending on what symptoms you're experiencing. So we're leaving out a large population, thereby creating bias in the way we make decisions about how the disease is progressing. So that's one bias issue that we're dealing with. Let me also talk about another system, which is the administrative system that helps us make decisions within the government. Citizens' requests coming in, and government officials make decisions based on those requests that come into this system. About 8,000 offices use it now, about 90,000 users, about 90 million requests have come in the last few years. So we use this system to understand efficiency of the specific government officials. We're now mining that data. Again, we're dealing with bias here because we have tens of thousands of government officials who don't use the system, tens of thousands of officials who don't use it actively on a daily basis. They use paper most of the time. Now we deal with a partial knowledge to make decision about the entire civil service. And so this is one bias issue that we're dealing with. And since we're dealing with, we're talking to experts here, I'd like to pose this bias as one problem. If I may just take 1 minute to also bring in a second problem that we're dealing with. So for the syndromic surveillance 333 health line that we created in the last few months, we're dealing with a lot of private sector data. A lot of telco data is coming in, a lot of mobility data, travel data, and we're merging that with the government's health information. So there is interoperability that needed to be established in the absence of a data sharing framework because we didn't have one. So now we're dealing with all this private sector data in a very secure environment. But as we go forward, obviously, both private sector and public sector organizations have said we need a data sharing framework. So that's another challenge that we have now. What is the right data sharing framework? What is the smart regulation that will enable innovation, but will also ensure the right type of privacy and the right type of data protection? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anir. And so I'm going to focus in on your first challenge just to get started. This issue of preventing bias and unfair outcomes created by AI systems, I think is something that a lot of governments are thinking about. And I think it is made especially challenging because it seems likely that it will be very difficult to force AI systems to be transparent. That AI systems may not be able to reveal, how certain recommendations were made, and depending on our data sets, they have all of these different kinds of blind spots, which I'm really glad that you're, in your case, you're very conscious of those blind spots. Now, Ananda, you have been doing work, as I understand, with the Indian government in the health sector in applying artificial intelligence. I'm wondering, have you run into some of these challenges, and what are some of the approaches that you're thinking about to help address them?
Yeah, thank you, Carl, and thank you, Anir, for setting up the challenge. Actually, I'm going to speak a little bit from my experience, but more probably, my background as an AI scientist, because so many of the questions that are raised are more fundamental than specific to particular systems of collecting data and using them. And I'll explain what I mean. Yeah, inherently, I agree. I mean, the biggest challenge about AI today is that, because of impoverished data may not be representative of everybody, that you're trying to apply the solution to. So if you use a small segment of the population on whom you collect the data, based on that, you make some decisions and make recommendations. It's quite likely that it will not be valid for somebody else who may not fit that, population that we may have. So in fact, but there are actually multiple reasons for bias of AI. And I'm going to try to talk about some of the ways of mitigating later, but let me first talk about some of the sources of the bias. One of them, is actually about, as Anis said, the data sampling may be biased and limited, and that's the most commonly thought about. But there's also another bias, which is kind of important to point out, which is that AI is a system that learn from teaching. In other words, it looks not only at the data, but how the data correlates with certain outcomes. So for example, let's say you're talking about a security threat or vulnerability to a particular type of disease situation. The AI is going to both take the inputs that indicate the symptomatic things as well as the output. Someone says this person is vulnerable or this person is a threat. And that can actually be a lot of bias induced by bad teaching. And bad teaching comes because the teachers, which are human beings, are ourselves in many cases biased. And that's something that may not be as obvious, but in fact an important factor in the way in which AI might be used. Another one, which is maybe not as obvious, is that the goals that are used in training a system may not be right for the application. In many cases, for instance, there's a trade-off in health between sensitivity and specificity. And you want to be highly sensitive. That means you want to find out any indication of something, but you want to be very specific. That means that if you say, that it's, what do you call that, it's there, it's definitely specific to that. In other words, it's not going to pull in everything in the world. You can call everyone sick, and that all the sick people will be part of that, but that's not what you want to do. And there is a trade-off between these two inherently. Systems that are more sensitive often tend to be less specific and vice versa. And an AI system might have been tuned to be particularly sensitive for a particular care situation or application, so that it triggers anytime there is some kind of alarm. But then you apply it to a situation where you want greater specificity, clearly it's going to do the wrong thing. So that's a trivial example, but this kind of goal bias in training AI system itself is a problem. And so these problems, I'm afraid, are not just going to go away through fixing regulations and mechanisms. Because if you look at, we all think about AI as this rational science that is sort of trying to mechanize the process of rational thinking and reasoning. In fact, Anir mentioned that it's about AI replacing human cognitive decision making. And that's actually precisely where the problem starts. If we give ourselves up to the AI to do the decision making that we ought to make, we should then trust the AI to make better decisions than we. And clearly, AI is no position to do that. I don't believe that at any point it will be in that position to do that, because all decision making is based on a bounded amount of knowledge and information, and it's likely to be only partially rational. So really, I think while we should make sure that we carefully evaluate AI systems and in terms of regulating them, make sure that these known sources of bias, namely data representation, classification, kind of teaching accuracy, and goals and so on, I think they should all be evaluated. But I don't believe that alone will eventually even solve the problem. I think what we have to look at is to say, when we talked about transparency, right? If a human being is biased, there is a feeling that you can discover their bias through asking them to be transparent. But the humans are not always very transparent. So in fact, the way in which society deals with bias is not by relying on people to be less biased, but by having a diverse set of actors who will, in some sense, challenge each other about their biases. And in any kind of a system, stability, I think, is reached more through making sure guarantees that all the different points of view are equally articulated or represented. And we just have to take AI as another very, very smart, but not very intelligent, actually, because some of the deeper knowledge that we have, AI is not there. But even, let's say, it becomes that way someday, it's still going to be another very smart citizen, faster than we can think in many cases, but perhaps not that much better when it comes to bias. And we need to build in checks and balances to integrate AI into the overall decision-making process rather than trusting it completely.
Thanks, Ananda. And just, you know, I'm pulling up from the chat here. Samar asks, is there a way in which AI-driven analysis and recommendations could be subject to independent peer review? So as we start thinking about, you know, how do we, what are these safeguards? What do they look like? Is peer review one of the strategies we ought to be looking at? Are there others that come to mind as well?
So in fact, I think the AI discipline is very actively looking at you know, ethical and safety considerations of AI and looking at these questions. I think peer review applies in a limited way. I mean, by peer review, I mean, you know, looking at a jury of peers evaluate the system. But that's not always feasible, because once the system gets deployed, it's going to be out there and it's going to continuously learn and make new decisions. And it's not really realistic to go back to a peer review in every time. So what you need is really have, you know, constant regulatory checks that have certain, you know, criteria that, I mean, we still have to define what they are, against which these systems are tested, like you will do with any other system that is, you know, where you are concerned about safety and things like that. And peer review may be useful in the beginning, but it's not enough.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Thanks for that. You know, I want to touch on the second challenge that Anir posed, which is around the sort of collaboration between the private sector and government. Anir talked a little bit about, you know, this fact that the government is using data from the private sector and vice versa. But of course, they're coming to the table with some very different interests. So, you know, whereas government might be thinking about an immediate crisis or maybe even thinking about long-term development outcomes, the private sector, of course, is thinking about the bottom line in many cases. Certainly, I'm sure it's not always the only thing that it thinks about, but certainly decision-making is very much driven by the sort of rules of kind of profit generation. And so, to Tony, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you've seen maybe frameworks or approaches that have been created to kind of bring these two stakeholders to the table in a way that is productive, that helps perhaps synthesize these different motives, or at least puts them you know, together in a way that is non-conflicting.
Sure, and that's a really challenging problem, Cal. So many things that can come up, and there's some really interesting things that came up in the session that I moderated just recently. So if I just go back to the challenge, we can think about governments and private sector actors having different incentives or motivations, and also working to different timeframes, I think, because of those different incentives. So technological innovation, I think, is often really outstripping policymaking and regulation, perhaps because corporations might have incentives to move quickly and sometimes break things, to kind of refer back to a previous motto by Facebook anyway. And the decision-making processes of governments and policymakers are by comparison a lot slower and I think more cumbersome as well. A point that came out in my panel on accountability and regulation is that we need to make the policymaking process faster and start earlier. And we also need businesses to perhaps slow down and be more deliberate. But a question that then comes up, and I think it's one that you alluded to, is whether we can slow down businesses, the developers of new technologies and AI-driven products, without stifling innovation. And I think that that's a question, you know, that comes up from the private sector. And one possible solution that was raised on our panel by Zvika Krieger, who's the director of responsible innovation for Facebook, one that he said can be applied by both private companies, their regulators, and also by policymakers, is prototype testing and what he called reiterative development. So rather than seeking to fully develop independently from the market and from society, companies release prototypes of a product. They then observe problems and anticipate future risks, and then they can improve the product to prevent the anticipated harms from taking place. He said that this is a strategy that can be adopted and also adapted by governments and policymakers, and I thought that was really interesting. Through a similar strategy of what he described as regulatory sandboxes, which allows selected firms to test innovative products and services in a controlled and really structured regulatory environment. And this allows regulators really to cooperate with the innovator in the private sector and allows products to go to the market faster, he described, but still being safe. So I thought that was a really, really interesting contribution. I should say, just as a final point as well, we had another person on the panel, Professor Saraj Hongladharam, who's at the University of Chulalongkorn, the University of Bangkok in Thailand. And he also wanted to really highlight the importance of self-regulation by these corporate bodies. And he said, if we're aiming for the social good, we can't always rely on the external regulators. We do have an obligation to regulate ourselves internally as well, that self-regulation.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I thought that was such a good point. And I think we have Suraj with us today, actually.
Oh, fantastic.
That really, you know, in many ways, government regulation is the floor. And if we really want to leverage AI for social good, we're going to count on businesses and the other implementers of artificial intelligence to start surfacing, you know, what are some of those opportunities to create positive social outcomes as well. Yeah. And so, Jaymund, I want to head over to you. You know, on this challenge of kind of thinking about the regulation of something that is, in some cases, so uncertain. You know, Tony's talked a little bit about the role of policy sandboxes, of kind of dipping our toes and you know, finding ways to let out these technologies into the wild, but in a really controlled manner to understand what are some of the implications. The traditional, you know, policy making process is often done through, it's a long process. It's, you know, you've got consultations, and because it's such a long and arduous process, governments often try to make policies that last. You know, we want to create policy frameworks that are going to last the next 5 or 10 years, and you know, hopefully. But in the case of artificial intelligence, we are, I think, struggling to understand some of the long-term implications of some of these fast-moving technologies. And certainly, we don't want to shut down all of that innovation. We want to effectively think about how do we calibrate risks. And so, Jaymund, how are you seeing governments that you're working with think about this challenge of calibrating risk and thinking through these longer-term implications?
Well, it's not something new, actually. Whenever we have new technologies, risk assessment and long-term risk, at the same time, risk-benefit comparison of new technologies, they are always very challenging and often broadly disagreeing among different people. And even the experts, they do have different opinions and different assessment. The extent to which the new technologies offer benefits to the human beings, at the same time, risk involved. So that it's always debatable. Of course, we do not want to be too late nor too early in regulating new technologies. Many of you might know the red flag in the UK. When an automobile was first introduced, many people had big concerns about the possible accidents, so that they came up with a regulation called red flag regulation, which required actually accompanied persons waving red flag in front of automobiles whenever people drove them. Because it's too slow, so that they really concerned about the traffic accidents. Well, this regulation somehow delayed advancement of automobile industry and then related technologies. Well, at the same time, we also have a regulatory lag, which means regulation delay despite growing, fast-moving technology. And then we see the problems, and then the response, regulatory response, is too late. I think it is more true that we have a higher level of uncertainty and unknown risks in fast-moving technologies like AI, particularly disruptive technologies, because it is not easy to build a social consensus on technological risk and benefits. It should be also noted that there is variation among different countries in terms of social tolerance of uncertainty and potential risk, as well as variation among different groups of people in a society. Recently, my research institute had a national survey, and we're asking people what would be the disruptive technology benefits and then costs or risks. And the interesting finding is that more educated and economically affluent population are more likely to perceive potential benefits of AIs and other disruptive technologies than risks, while less educated population perceive more risks than the other group. So until we have rational calibration of technological risks based on more scientific findings, technological risk calibration is always challenging. Well, this is why risk communication in a society and really narrowing the knowledge gap among different people is also very, very significant. At the same time, even the scientific findings offered by the business groups might be different from the research groups. So I think, which one is more reliable than the other is also a challenging question. So I think that's ongoing, but it really depending on the social acceptance of the uncertainty. And sometimes it really pushed by the very active and proactive industrial policy interest by the government. So I think that it's I don't think there is a really fixed solution for that, but I think in the shaping out the social consensus in a society is compellingly important.
Thanks, Jaymund. And I just want to follow up on one piece around that, which is the idea of risk appetite. Do you think that, and you're primarily doing your work in Asia, are you seeing differing risk appetites in this region when it comes to perhaps society, how society wants AI to be governed than perhaps in the West?
Well, I think even Asian countries are not the same. China, Japan, Korea, for example, and the way they perceive the risk involving in AI quite different. And as I mentioned before, the social preference or acceptance for autonomous vehicles are quite different among the three Asian countries. So that, I don't think there's one answer for that. But I think, the government position is also very important. In many Asian countries, many people see government and state as a sort of parents of figures. So whenever you have some risk identified and that they asking government to regulate those. So that's parenthood in a society. And I think that's something to do with the sometimes over-regulations. At the same time, that's conflicting with the national agenda for promoting AI-based industries. So on the one hand, where there's a demand for regulating AI, considering potential risks, at the same time, very proactive industrial policy to promote AI-based industries. That gives different signals. So I think many countries are between the two, and sometimes a political compromise and bargaining is there.
Thanks. And Tony, would you like to add something on that?
Yeah, no, I think those are excellent points that Jaymund has just made. And one of the things he said is, of course, there are different conceptions of the social good, if I'm to paraphrase, in different places. And you've also raised that there are different levels of acceptance of risk. But I wanted to highlight as well as there being different conceptions of social good, different groups are affected differently by AI technologies as well. So there will be some that will be negatively affected in a way that perhaps more privileged groups are not. And one of the things that came up back in our session as well is the importance of ensuring that a diversity of perspectives contribute to this process of mitigating future harms in policymaking. And a point that was brought up was that we should include vulnerable populations as well as marginalized groups in this deliberation, and that's essential So we get a sense not only of, what are the harms that we should be anticipating, but how different technologies might affect different groups in radically different ways, regardless of our perceptions of the good. That was my point. Thanks, Cal.
I just want to add one more point, if I can. Regarding the many stakeholders involvement, I just want to share one report, recent report produced based on more than 80 ethical guidelines of AI. So that they try to look at different ethical guidelines and principles, and sometimes hammered by business groups, sometimes by research groups, associations, and sometimes public agencies. And overall, industries, professional associations, academia, and governments are actively involved in working on ethical guidelines for AI. But relatively speaking, if you look at different stakeholders' involvement, civic organizations and citizen engagements are less than other major players. So I think we need more inputs from citizens' perspectives. But in the process, I think there are sometimes their participation and engagement are lacking, and I think that's something we need to consider in the future.
Yeah, and I'm hearing that a big piece of this is actually looping back to where we started the conversation is the blind spots in our policymaking processes, and it's not I think that that comment on the inclusion of diverse groups, it's not just about kind of are we making these processes open to people, but are we actually reaching out and going and finding the people who are not included and bringing them in. I'm going to go to Ananda, and then I'm going to invite actually one of our guests as well to share a point. So Ananda, go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple of points. I think with respect to regulation, I think it's worthwhile keeping in mind a couple of things, right? One is, I think any new technology, the technology benefits usually when they show up, they tend to bias the sort of prioritization towards the use of the technology without fully understanding risks. And the risks are come up a bit later. I would say that you'll find it with respect to steel industry or industrial revolution, the effect that coal and other thing had on people's health. Those came later, and I think in that sense, it's not surprising that in AI, the voice of the citizen groups are not quite yet there. But the key problem is the speed at which things are happening. What might have been happening over a period of a decade might be happening over a period of a year or 2 years now, and whether we are able to keep up with that and the damage that could be caused could be quite rapid. I think that's a meta level problem that we have found, in the exponential rate of technology growth, that I don't know if we have ever adjusted our regulatory processes to handle that. And in AI, I think it points to a need for more dynamic approach to thinking about regulation itself, perhaps. The second point that I wanted to make is a comment was made with respect to AI's perception of AI between the haves and have-nots. There's a counterintuitive point of view here, which is, in fact, I think potentially there are rich benefits to be reaped for the poor and underserved communities through AI, primarily because a lot of the lack of progress is due to a lack of good application of human capacity or lack of human capacity to provide the kind of decision-making and care. And in fact, we may be able to empower less qualified frontline workers to benefit from some of the AI-based, say, advice giving and so on, to do a better job. But right there is a risk, right? In doing so, we run the risk of the basic knowledge and the hands-on experience of the frontline workers being rejected or in favor of whatever this technology might provide. So I think that's a double-edged sword, but one I think we should not abandon simply because we are afraid of regulating it, but we should do it carefully. And those are just a couple of points that occurred when others were talking.
Yeah, thanks, Ananda. And I think just a reflection on our conversation so far. We've talked a lot about risks, and I think, and sometimes, we go to the private sector and they talk about all of the possibilities. I think it's important for us to think about, are we balancing our conversations about AI governance and regulation, both from a risk and an opportunity, standpoint. I'd like to invite, Mark Findlay onto our panel briefly. Mark, you had a really interesting comment that he shared on data feedback loops. And just a bit of background, Mark is, I think, the director now for the Center for AI and Data Governance at Singapore Management University. He's also one of the contributors to the AI for Social Good report. Mark, do you want to share with us your thought on this?
Yeah, I'll be quick, Cal. Thank you very much for the invitation to come on. 2 points that have been made by the panel members, and the panels have really been very informative in terms of the things that we've been talking about today. 2 points. One is the need for citizen inclusion, and the other is the importance of self-regulation. There's a problem with marrying the two. And we've found in a lot of work, particularly the stuff that we're doing on platform economies, that to get citizen participation, particularly the participation of vulnerable members of the market, such as gig workers, there's a problem of a lack of information. Now, AI can create information and pass it to one party and keep it away from another party, which it does in the platform situation, where platform operators produce an enormous amount of secondary data and sell it without the customers or the drivers knowing anything about it. Now, AI can also act as a regulatory disruptor. It can produce information loops that go back to the vulnerable members of that market, those who produce the data but don't know about it, and therefore they can become more democratically involved in a genuine participatory regulatory framework. And I just emphasize the point that when we talk about self-regulation, there is such a vast range of different forms. I think it's important to remember that self-regulation has to be, to some extent, taught to those individuals in the AI ecosystem that don't really either understand it or care very much about it. And platform operators are a good subgroup of just that problem. And so basically with the concept of information loops, it's what John Braithwaite talks about in relation to enforced self-regulation, where you have some rules. And if the platform operators are going to sell secondary data, then the data subjects need to get the benefit of the information looped back to them so that they know about what is in the market and what isn't, so that they can benefit or so that they can control that data being sold. One problem obviously is privacy, because there are many data subjects in information loops, but that's a technical problem. But I think the concept of information looping and using AI as a regulatory disruptor, rather than just simply part of the problem, is a bit more creative in the way that we approach the issue.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I just want to turn things back to our panel briefly. Does anyone want to kind of respond to Mark's comment? Maybe Ananda, any thoughts on this this question of these kind of loops? I mean, is this something that you think, and you come from a data science background, I mean, you've helped kind of lead researcher in this space. Do you think this is something that is going to be unduly onerous, or do you think it's actually a solvable technical challenge?
So I'll take a slightly different point of view. And first, I'll admit, I'm not an expert on policy making, regulation, and so forth. But right off the bat, I'm somewhat skeptical about too much of a belief in self-regulation. And the reason for that is, I think somebody had made a comment in the chat. There is a certain amount of conflict of interest on the part of technology creators, and what are they trying to maximize? The application and use of their technology, and then returning benefits of economic benefits for themselves, and the risks associated with it. This is an inherent conflict. So I think self-regulation, may be possible if it's conducted in a very governed and transparent manner, where the players are forced to apply certain amount of slightly more meta level criteria that will inform what they subject to. But I'm not totally comfortable leaving it in the hands of the producers themselves. I do think that government actually has a very, very strong role to play at this point in the game, because the way in which we set up these mechanisms and to make sure that the market forces are carefully managed will inform the what happens in the long run, and will also have a significant effect on how these things are done and their consequences. So high level, I do think that we shouldn't believe too much in self-regulation, but expertise does lie with the technology providers, and we do need to make sure that we benefit from that knowledge and try to bring them in that way.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, I think I just want to come back on that a little bit and say that self-regulation is really important. Going back to Suraj's point from the earlier session, and also some points that were made here, I absolutely agree that it's not enough and undone on its own, but it's absolutely essential alongside external regulation, especially when innovation is proceeding more quickly than policymakers are. So I think that we need to have some sort of social norm where corporations, innovators do feel that they have to self-regulate alongside then responding to policies that we so slowly are developing. So that was my point. Yeah.
So Tony, that's great. Yeah, no, fantastic. And I just want to I want to ask a follow up on that,
sure.
which is what does good self-regulation look like? Because I think part of our discussion is less, is it a good thing or a bad thing, and it's more of kind of what does it look like when it's good. And Mark talked about enforced self-regulation, and I think that there was a particular flavor to that. But Tony, I'll stick to you first, and then I think someone else wanted to ask a question on or make a point on this. What does good self-regulation look like?
Yeah, well, I think good self-regulation involves the innovator, the developer, the corporation really spending the time to look at possible risks and anticipating harms. It's not enough to say, oh, well, we didn't know that was going to be a harm. We couldn't have seen, there's an obligation to anticipate these harms and then actively try to mitigate them. Not just saying, well, we're going to create things as quickly as we can. There's no way we can possibly know what the potential harms are. When it happens, it's then up to the regulators to deal with it. I think there is that, what good self-regulation looks like is accepting that that body has a responsibility to anticipate these harms. And I think there are things that we can do to make sure that those innovators and those corporations do self-regulate. When there are harms, even if they were unintentional, which they often are, these are unintended consequences, that we say actually that innovator, that developer is to blame for those harms, that the naming and shaming after the fact hopefully will contribute in the future to these innovators taking responsibility more themselves. Is that too harsh? I'm not sure.
Jaymund?
I think regulation is like grabbing small chick. So if you grab hard, and then chick will die. If you grab too loose, and then probably it goes away. So it's very difficult. I do believe self-regulation, but at the same time, as we move from moralizing stage to legalizing or policy stage, the role of government becomes more explicit and significant. In fact, at the moralizing stage, there are many stakeholders can raise their voices and really try to identify some of the big issues and some of the values that we want to achieve. But as we have more specific policy issues, and then we need to be very explicit. And I think, to some extent, we need to build very sophisticated governance structure through which we make AI policies and regulations. In terms of the ethical principles, based on 24 selected ethical guidelines I looked at carefully, and some of the ethical principles emphasized by different guidelines made by government or businesses. And government versions tend to stress public and social benefits, fairness, transparency, explainability, but less controllability and privacy. The industry versions tend to emphasize, they also emphasize public and social benefits, of course, privacy and fairness, but less accountability and safety. So that I think, their positions seemingly very similar, but certainly very different. In practice, they do have very different positions. To avoid any, Carl, you mentioned the blind spots. I think it is important to consider establishing a comprehensive committee rather than specific agency, government agency, as a leading organization at the beginning. But as time goes, there are different industry specific regulation might be demanded. And then particular agencies should take lead in shaping out the regulation. Of course, incorporating different voices from different stakeholders. But, as we move to legalizing and regulating stage, government role might be expected and then demanded and important, I think.
Thanks so much, Jaymund. Anir, I was actually just going to circle to you, so go ahead.
Great, thanks. I think it's a wonderful discussion. Now, when we're talking about self-regulation and regulation by the government, whether the government should be heavy-handed and that will stifle innovation, or whether the government should be light and allow a lot of innovation, I think one thing that I would point out is there is such a large spectrum of understanding of what AI really is and what it can and cannot do, and what it should and should not do within government, within academia, and within private sector as well. So in context of Bangladesh, and I'm sure that this is also true in many other countries, there is I think, education process that we have to go through. So when we talk about self-regulation, first we have to understand if we have to make those decisions from the government side, what should and should not be done. And I think there is such little understanding of what AI can and cannot do, how actually data plays a role in terms of bias and exclusion, how data interoperability must be set up. So I think there is a lot of education process that we need to go through first before we start talking about what to regulate. And obviously, we carry around AI systems in our pocket all the time. We are using intelligent assistants and all of that without even realizing it. So as we are building system deliberately for social good in the context of a specific country, I mean, what we carry around in our pocket is a general public or social good that has been created by maybe Google or Facebook or large multinational technology companies. But when we have to look at it from the perspective of government, I think there's a big education process that we need to go through that we're doing currently in Bangladesh. Just next week, we are actually going to do a presentation to the members of the cabinet to make them understand what some of these frontier technologies like AI can and cannot do to improve citizen service delivery and also leapfrog in terms of how to advance the country in many different sectors. So I think that is a very important thing that we need to keep in mind. So in stakeholders, we talk about citizens, excluded groups, but even before going there, I think we need to go through an education process for our policymakers. In terms of skills of developing AI systems, so there is a big bit of a lag in countries like Bangladesh. We have had to really look for companies, primarily startup companies, and potentially telcos in the large company sector, and maybe few academicians who have really been able to guide us on what really should and should not be done in terms of developing systems and also thinking about regulation. So I really want to emphasize that education process for policymakers, industry, and academia that we need to go through. Thank you.
Thank you, Anir. And I want to thank our fantastic panel today for engaging in some debate, for sharing some of their thoughts and experiences kind of working at the frontiers of AI policy. You know, just to help us wrap up and summarize, I think over the course of this conversation and the last two conversations that we had on the topic of governance, we really identified sort of 7 key challenges for policymakers, government stakeholders to be thinking about when it comes to governance and artificial intelligence. The first one is this challenge of understanding the long-term implications of fast-moving technologies and effectively calibrating your risk appetite. The second one is around preventing bias and unfair outcomes produced by AI systems that were not likely to be able to make transparent. The third is, I think, getting private sector stakeholders around the table when government and private sector actually have very different motives, they have very different time horizons. We now have the frameworks to make transparent and ensure ethics around some of these collaborations. I think fourth, and Jaymund, you touched on this just now a little bit, is this challenge of, you know, the lead agency around your AI policy is going to create its own blind spots, right? So if you have someone from a trade sort of leading your national AI strategy, then it's going to have a lot of trade considerations, but perhaps not some other essential considerations. And so you talked about this sort of committee and what kind of lead agency might we consider to address this challenge. And then there are, I think, 3 more sort of challenges that we didn't touch on this conversation, but did come up in our previous sessions for policymakers to consider. The fifth one is around creating processes that can answer both moral and policy questions. You know, as we are engaging in these new areas, one of the things that's surfacing is we're trying to create policy in spaces where certain moral questions, certain ethical questions may not have yet been answered. And we need to find ways to deal with those questions at the same time as we're trying to deal with some of these policy challenges. Otherwise, we may end up with these sort of policy vacuums. The sixth one is thinking about how to reframe this conflict between making data private and limiting the growth of AI, or making data open and potentially creating privacy challenges. Mark referred to that a little bit with these data loops and said, you know, we can do both of these, but we need to ensure that there is agency, that people know how their data are being used. And then the last, I think, challenge for us to think about in the policymaking space and the governance space is taking advantage, you know, how do we take advantage of emerging AI technologies in sectors where there's limited readiness and few capable partners. And so we heard about some experiences in different countries where there was a desire to apply artificial intelligence in a sector, but the partners on the ground weren't necessarily ready to do so. So those are 7 policy challenges for us to think about when we're thinking about governance in the AI space. Now, to help us wrap up this wonderful month on artificial intelligence for social good, I want to pass things over to Christina at APRU.
Thanks so much, Cal, Anandan, Tony, Jay, and Anir for being with us today and sharing your insights for this discussion. And thank you to all participants who joined the session today and engaged in the chat and actively shaped this important debate, which has been fantastic. It's been really good. For participants in this session, as Cal pointed out, we have had many insights. So we'll be sharing a policy insight briefing that summarizes the key points and the challenges that have been discussed today on governance in Asia and AI governance in Asia. And this will include today's points and the 2 previous discussions on accountability and co-regulations. So if you're interested in getting in touch with any of the experts from today or any of the other summit session speakers, or want to find out more about the summit and the overall AI for Social Good project, then feel free to email me. You should see the relevant contact details on the slides that are coming, and I'm falling over my words because I know that we're running over. I'm very sorry about this. But I really want to take 1 minute. I so want to thank, again, our partners, Google, UN ASCAP, and the Rockefeller Foundation for contributing and supporting the summit. And I want to thank all our contributing partners and the speakers for sharing their insights and their time today and over the last 5 weeks really for the summit, for their support, for the commitment, and for this overall project. Without this, it would have not been possible. So I thank all participants who have joined us for the summit throughout the month of November for their dedication and important contributions. I know many of you have joined for numerous sessions. In case you have missed any of our previous sessions, you can visit our website. You will find the recording for each session you may want to catch up on. So there's nothing that you will miss. You can go back and you will get the reports. And please also read the project report itself. Now, I'm wishing you a wonderful and restful day, and take care, and thank you again so very much.